Whoa, never been so much fun. 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 You go to your brother, kill him with your gun, leave him lying in his uniform, dying in the sun. Whoa. Whoa.
Now it's been way too long since I last looked at anything by Sensible Software. Hell, it's been over a year. Since my 4-part series on Sensible Soccer, which does happily remain one of my best loved sets of vids, and many thanks for that, I've barely mentioned them. They were wonderful developers, a small, closely knit team with a sense of camaraderie that was no doubt hardened through many nights of drinking guest ale in luxurious vistas round Saffron Walden. And of course, making games that had more personality and were just flat out more fun than basically anything else. Sensible Software didn't make all that much in the end, but almost everything they made, at least in their prime period, was classic. This puts them way ahead of, say, the Bitmap brothers, to use another bunch of British Amiga developers who get covered a fair bit on this here channel. Anyway, let's revisit Jules, Jops and Company, and look at perhaps their second best loved series of games. But firstly, a quick recap to show just how we got here. In 1991, Sensi made Megalomania, a real-time strategy game where you controlled lots of little sprites and got them killing each other with increasingly more elaborate weapons. The little sprites gave Sensi a bit of an idea, and they designed a primitive football pitch in Megalomania's engine, and this would be the inspiration for Sensible Soccer, and well, we know all about that. From that game onwards, Little People pretty much became a Sensi trademark, and the next step was to stick them into another war game. But this one would be different. You'd be right there in the thick of the jungle, controlling a small team, dodging enemy fire left, right and centre. You would be a merry band of brothers. Hell, you'd even be playing as Sensible Software themselves. You wouldn't have much hope of surviving, of course, but there would always be a new bag of meat ready to jump through the door and take your place. And so Cannon Fodder was born, and released in 1993, to much wailing and gnashing of teeth. It was pretty frickin' provocative at the time. Some complain about games that make political statements these days, but Cannon Fodder was doing it 20 years ago. It is comparable in spirit to something modern like, say, Spec Ops: The Line. It opens with one of gaming's most iconic songs, War Has Never Been So Much Fun, a lazy yet threatening and utterly insistent skank that never quite leaves your head. The soldiers line up to be punted through a door and into battle, their eagerness contrasted by the hill that overlooks them, which as the game progresses will become lined more and more with the gravestones of the fallen. A big harsh anti-war streak runs a mile wide all the way through the game. Even in the game itself, when you're spending most of the time just peppering enemies with lead, you're frequently confronted with the sight of enemies slowly bleeding out after you shoot them, and well, that ain't pretty at all, even for tiny sprites like this. The ground is quite simply splattered with caustic British irony. War is not, has been, and never will be fun. And then there's the cover art. The world's foremost emblem of remembrance, the poppy, contrasted with those two simple, blunt words, Cannon Fodder. I mean, geez, even Banksy might balk at something like that. Especially when you end up showcasing the game on Remembrance Day itself, as they did. It's striking, certainly, and when you consider the origins of the poppy and the millions that died in World War I, an entire generation of lost souls, and the government's general lack of action when it comes to being responsible for the whole thing, well, it's grim, it's vicious, but it's born out of anger at the hideousness of war, and it's an anger that should be respected. Even now, nearly 100 years after the monstrous anger of the guns and the shrill demented choirs of wailing shells, the care of soldiers affected by past and present conflicts is still something that, in the government's eyes, should be fostered onto other people, even though they're responsible for it. Which makes this particular picture of a group of noted warmongers staining the cenotaph with their pimped out poppy wreaths little more than a sneering insult. But I digress. In a time when the likes of Mortal Kombat and Doom were filling up column inches every week with screeds about violent video games, you can hazard a guess that Cannon Fodder received similar treatment, particularly from the Daily Star and the British Legion themselves, who weren't exactly happy about the way their symbol was used. The anti-war message of the game was largely ignored and or dismissed, and there were quite a few calls for the game to be banned. You know, it was just another violent video game. Even the gaming press got into trouble over it, particularly Amiga Power, who had planned to reprint the Poppy cover in their magazine. The Poppy cover was ultimately pulled both for the magazine and the game, although it is still retained in the game itself. And all the message and the details of the game were, of course, ignored. Because in truth, Cannon Fodder does more to humanise soldiers, both yours and the enemy, than just about any other war game did at the time. Hell, more than just about any other war game, full stop. Your soldiers have names, and the fallen are always remembered, forever. At every turn in the game, you're met with something that reminds you of the stupidity and hopelessness of the whole thing. I mean, today in a world of faceless, shooty-face games with shallow Christmas card war is hell messages, Cannon Fodder would still stand out. In fact, if released today in this current climate of unquestioning patriotism, it might be even more controversial now than it was in 1993. It's a bitter pill, and it might well make you angry. But, you know, it should. Any good piece of art should provoke a reaction of some kind, and that's something video games have to take on board. Otherwise, the perceived accomplishments of the whole games as art movement amounts to little more than a few reprints of Four Dogs Playing Poker. In the end though, this quote from the manual perhaps sums Cannon Fodder up best. Don't try playing this at home, kids, because war is not a game. War, as Cannon Fodder demonstrates in its own quirky little way, is a senseless waste of human resources and lives. We hope that you never have to find out the hard way. That last line's kinda tragic when you think about it 20 years on. Now, you might have noticed that I have reviewed the game and so far have spent almost no time on actually discussing the mechanics of the game itself, which I will not apologise for. The message and what the game tried to achieve comes first. As good as Cannon Fodder's gameplay is, and trust in me that it's very, very good, it's secondary to what the game tried to say. It's very simple to control, with pretty much everything handled by the mouse, moving with the left button and shooting with the right. You'll set multiple tasks in each level, usually based around killing all the enemies and taking out buildings that pump out endless enemies, gauntlet style, until you lob a grenade in their direction. The game gets very tough indeed, and quite quickly. A lot of the phases in Cannon Fodder are long, and if you're not paying full attention to everything, then things aren't going to go well. Both the enemy and your soldiers die in one hit, after all. You can be prowling along in an open space, you miss a guy with a bazooka in the corner, and boom! They're all dead in a nanosecond. You didn't even have time to think about it. It pays to take missions slowly, to split your group up and perhaps send a guy out on recon. The rocket guys, for example, are much better dealt with by a single soldier who can avoid their rockets, as opposed to a cumbersome snake of the damned that'll be ripped apart by them. As a game, Cannon Fodder is masterful. You can't deny the game's adrenaline rush and how on edge it makes you feel. The truly exceptional thing about it, though, is that there is just so much more to it, and that places it right up there with Sensible Soccer as the group's greatest achievement, and one of the best games of the 1990s. The gaming press as a whole were in agreement too. Anti-war message or not, the game was celebrated everywhere as nearly all Sensi Software titles were, and as you might have guessed, the controversy sent sales through the roof. Almost every Amiga magazine going dished out 90s to the game as if they were going out of style. And hell, one particular games journalist, Amiga Power's Stuart Campbell, a forever outspoken and frequently funny Scottish flat top, buggered off to Sensi Software and worked on the sequel. For yes, there would be one. And as you know, these things can go either way. You know, what am I going to say? Is it like Speedball, where the sequel was a stunning improvement in every possible way? Or is it like the Chaos Engine, where the game floundered in development hell and laid waste to any hope of a future for the series? That and Cannon Fodder was already a classic. It was going to be a very tough act to follow it. But a sequel did come, and it was released in 1994. A neat little turnaround, no more trouble than usual in development, and a bit of a different feel. With the message part mostly done with, Cannon Fodder 2 is mostly about the game. There's more of a general and fantastical story this time, in which our soldiers are captured by aliens and sent travelling through time and space. You're now fighting in plenty of other places aside from the jungle. There's the desert, Chicago in 1930, a medieval setting, and the alien mothership that ties the whole thing together. Kinda reminds me of Lemmings a little, actually. The anti-war aspect of the first game has been toned down a little this time, although it is still there, but then I guess there's no real way you could have topped what they did in the first game. And on the face of things, not a lot has changed about the gameplay. The controls and the general objectives are pretty much the same. Cannon Fodder 2 is perhaps more like a mission pack than a full-blown sequel. You know, if it ain't broke, then don't fix it. And this maybe disappointed a few people at the time who might have been expecting more, although the game was still regarded as excellent and was rightly very well received. More Cannon Fodder was always going to be welcome. And, you know, to be honest, there is actually a pretty large difference when it comes down to how the two games were designed, and what they try to do in their levels. The aforementioned Stuart Campbell ended up designing most of the levels in Cannon Fodder 2, and naturally he brought his own spin on the game. His sensibilities are quite arcadey, with preference given to short, sharp shocks of gameplay as opposed to lengthy passages. Whereas the original usually featured huge, lengthy levels, this one features mostly small, contained areas that are often packed full of enemies. Here's one where your squad quite literally starts out on the centre of a bullseye. Sometimes you don't have any time to think at all. Like the best arcade games, you simply have to act. And you can certainly expect to lose a hell of a lot of soldiers because, ooh boy, it is a tough game. Perhaps tougher than the original. Although to be fair to it, it's much more consistent with its difficulty. The original game starts out with fairly normal difficulty, only to suddenly get incredibly hard around mission 8 or so. Whereas the sequel starts out difficult, but gradually increases the difficulty throughout the game. It's a much more even curve. It feels fairer. The frequent changes in surroundings may appear to be little more than reskins at first, but each of them do have certain unique traps you have to be aware of, such as the insta-death floors on the mothership. One of the best parts, though, are the occasional references to old classics you find here and there. The aforementioned single-screen levels do remind me quite a bit of Robotron, for example. Or there's this stage that takes its layout straight from Tapper. The enemies are the customers, and the doors you have to blow up are the glasses and the tips. And this medieval stage takes a leaf right out of the Spectrum classic Chaos, with its placement of wizards, trees and the like, pretty much coming directly from said game. It should be noted that a lot of this information does come from Stuart Campbell himself, who wrote a wonderful commentary on Cannon Fodder 2 for his own website. I'll link to it in the description, you should read it. As someone who had previously struggled with Cannon Fodder 2 and had dismissed it as a very good game but still basically a mission pack, being able to read his own thought processes behind the levels did help me understand what he was trying to do, and when I play through the game now I have a lot more fun with it as a result. And when you look closer at it instead of simply struggling with it and crying about how hard it is, the differences that are there definitely stand out. I would still put the first game on top, but Cannon Fodder 2 is, in the end, a very worthy sequel indeed. If you like the first game, and you've never happened to play the second, then trust me, it's definitely worth doing so. My opinion, you know, I reckon it deserves more recognition as a jolly good video game sequel. And so, that's Cannon Fodder. Two games that are both excellent in their own way. Classics that not only speak of the era they were made in, that old-time Britpop of the early 90s, those Parkers and Fila tracksuits that might as well be in a fucking silent movie now. Not that most Amiga people were probably into any of that, but hey, games like Cannon Fodder did more than they ever really needed to do, and they can't be thanked enough for that. Oh yeah, I guess there was some other strategy game that came out under the Cannon Fodder name, released on Steam about a year or so ago, but I've heard it's a massive pile of shit and nothing at all like the original, and therefore I have absolutely no interest in covering it. So there. I will simply leave it with these two greats. Not just one, but two of the best games of the whole decade. And as for war, well, it's horrible. It's savage. It's humankind at its most tragic and hopeless. But sometimes, just a little teensy-weensy bit of the time, it's fun! And with that said, it's time to end the video. Thanks for watching, and wherever you are, whoever you be, have a good one, take care, and I'll see you next time.